The second example that I want to point at is what we started off with in John chapter 13. We all know the story. Jesus rose up during supper. They all came together for supper. Jesus rose up during supper and he washed the feet of his disciples. At that time, there were two hand washings. The first hand washing was done by the head of the table, and this was done earlier on in the ceremony. In a later part of the ceremony, just before the main meal, all the people involved in the ceremony would get up and wash their hands. But in the first hand washing, only the head of the table would wash their hands. So when Jesus got up, there was no surprise because they thought that he was just going to go and wash his hands. But he got up, took off his upper garment, wrapped himself with a towel, poured water in a basin, and started to wash the feet of the disciples. Now, the way they sat around the table was that they reclined at the table. And the way they reclined was there was a table and there were no chairs. There was only cushions or divans that were around the table. And so they reclined with their left hand and their feet were back so that they could eat with their right hand. And to see how this is in an example, let's look at Luke chapter 7. This is an account when more than a year before this incident, Jesus was invited to a Pharisee's house. Luke chapter 7 verse 36 following, when one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. Who reclines at a table? Well, you recline at a table when there are no chairs, and that's how you sit. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, so she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping. So the feet of the person was behind, and that's why the woman stood behind him. Verse 44, then Jesus turned toward the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet. That was almost like a basic thing. As they walk on the dusty Jewish roads, they come back with dust on their feet. The Pharisee did not give water to wash their feet. All their feet were dirty. As they came for the Last Supper, all their feet were dirty. So rather than doing hand washing like the head of the table would, Jesus got up and, like the slave in the room, he washed the feet of his disciples. In fact, this job was not for any slave. This job would not be done by a Jewish slave. Only a non-Jewish slave would wash the feet of somebody. It was such a demeaning job. It was such a humiliating thing. So I tried to think of some parallel or an equivalent for today that would be equally humiliating, and I could not think of anything quickly. But I thought of something that is more disgusting than humiliating. What if somebody threw up and you had to clean it up? What if Jesus went around the room and cleaned up each disciple's vomit? Nobody wants to clean up somebody else's vomit. I mean, you have to pay me to clean up somebody else's vomit. Unless it's your kid, and even then, you're going to make them pay for it later on. But nobody wants to clean up somebody else's vomit. Imagine that next Sunday when you went to church, you sat right next to a person who has been causing you heartache for the last 6 months. And that person did not come with his family, he came by himself. And in the middle of the service, he throws up and passes out. Now what? What are you going to do? I mean, you're not going to make him clean up. He passed out. He has no family members to clean up. Are you going to clean it up? You see, nobody wants to do it. It's a task that nobody wants to do. Foot washing was a humiliating task that even a Jewish slave wouldn't do. But Jesus started with Peter, and the way they were sitting was, it was a triangular table with three sides occupied, one side not occupied, so that the food could come onto the table. So there were three sides that were occupied. Peter sat in one corner and Jesus started with him. We think Jesus started with him because if Jesus ended with him, he would not have put up that much of a resistance. But Jesus started with him, and so he gave this resistance as he was trying to defend the honor of Jesus. Opposite Peter was John, and there was nobody else in between. Opposite Peter was John. How do we know this? Because at some point in the Last Supper, Peter asks John who was going to betray Jesus, and nobody else heard it. Next to John, on the left side of John, was Jesus. How do we know this? At some point in the conversation, John asks Jesus secretly who was going to betray him. And the Bible says that John leaned back into Jesus. And that can happen only when he sat on the right side and they were all using their left hand to recline. So on the left side of John was Jesus. On the left side of Jesus was Judas. How do we know this? Because at some point in the Last Supper, Jesus and Judas had a personal conversation when Jesus mentioned that somebody was going to betray him, and all the disciples started talking amongst each other. Judas turned to him and asked, "Is it me, Master?" And Jesus told him, "Yes." But therein lies the problem. According to Jewish law, if there are more than two people in a Passover, the center seat should be taken by the head of the table. And in a group of 13 people, on one side of the table there are 5 seats. The center seat should have been reserved for the head of the table, and that seat was taken by Judas. And so when Jesus gave him the first dip of the bread and the herbs dipped in the wine, that first bite should have been taken by the head of the table. Instead, Jesus dipped it, and as a sign that he was going to be the betrayer, Jesus gave it to Judas. You see, Judas had usurped the seat at the head of the table that belonged to Jesus. And it is probably that incident that set in series the motion of events and the dispute about who was going to be the greatest. And as Jesus washed the feet of the disciples, he starts with Peter, comes around the table. The last person to have their feet washed is John, but just before John, Jesus washes the feet of Judas, the one who would betray him shortly. It would have been surprising if a Jewish slave washed the feet of everybody. But that's not what happened. It is not that the disciples washed one another's feet. That's not what happened. It's not that the disciples washed the rabbi's feet. That's not what happened. It is that the Lord of the universe, the creator of the universe, the Lord and Master himself washed the dirty feet of the disciples. And not only any disciple, he also washed the feet of the one who was about to betray him to death a few hours later. That is unthinkable. Once he was done, he wore his upper garment again, sat at the table, and for the very first time accepted their terms of leadership for him as Master and Lord, as Master, as Teacher and Lord. If the Master humbled himself, how much more should his disciples? As the youngest person, Jesus did not hold on to his titles of teacher and Lord. And as a servant, he fulfilled the need by washing the feet of everybody in the room. The feet needed to be washed because they were dirty. And there was no slave there to wash it. And none of the disciples offered to wash it, so Jesus did. The interesting thing is that nobody washed the feet of Jesus. The next time any fluid would touch the feet of Jesus would be when his own blood would bathe his feet as the nail pierced through it at his crucifixion.